Tom Cameron Swayze.
Brett Huntley. David Brainerd. John Shannon. Tom Brokaw.
In harm's way, tonight an update on the condition of ABC News co-anchor Bob Woodruff and his cameraman after that roadside bomb attack in Iraq. What happens next? Terror tapes, an emotional new tape of an American journalist held hostage in Iraq, and new video from Al-Qaeda's number 2 man. He survived that airstrike in Pakistan. Faith, hope, and charity. Tonight, those without all three are wondering whatever happened to the millions of dollars donated after Katrina. And State of the Union, a new NBC News poll tonight on how the voters feel about President Bush, wiretapping, and the lobbying scandal in Washington.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. Tonight in a U.S. military hospital in Germany, there are 2 civilian patients. Bob Woodruff, co-anchor of ABC's World News Tonight, and his veteran cameraman, Doug Vogt, were both wounded yesterday while riding in the open hatch of an Iraqi military vehicle when a roadside bomb went off north of Baghdad. While an accurate prognosis may take days or longer to determine, the incident vividly shows once again the dangers in Iraq. Dangers faced daily by U.S. forces, by Iraqi civilians, but not as often by the journalists who are there to cover the war. We begin here tonight with NBC's Jim Maceda in Landstuhl, Germany.
Landstuhl Hospital outside Frankfurt, one of the U.S. military's largest. Inside, Bob Woodruff and Doug Vogt are under heavy sedation in the intensive care unit, in stable but serious condition.
These 2 individuals sustained injuries to their upper chest, neck, and face and brain.
Both were hit by an improvised explosive device, or IED, on Sunday while working on a story about Iraqi forces. The attack occurred in the insurgent town of Taji, north of Baghdad. Vogt was taping Woodruff in an Iraqi armored personnel carrier, the lead vehicle in a joint U.S.-Iraqi convoy, when the roadside bomb detonated, triggering an ambush. Woodruff and Vogt were wearing protective armor and helmets. Doctors here say it probably saved their lives. And they are encouraged by small signs of improvement in the men. Still, the coming days are crucial.
Most of our patients will stay here anywhere from 48 to 72 hours before transport back to the States.
But it's unclear how serious their injuries are. NBC's Tom Brokaw spoke with Woodruff's wife, Lee, and told the Today Show that the swelling in Woodruff's brain had apparently eased after surgery to reduce pressure on the brain. Vogt had shrapnel lifted from his brain, but according to ABC News President David Weston, is reportedly in better overall condition than Woodruff. Despite the nature of the injuries, surgeons are cautiously upbeat.
In most cases, whether they're severe or not, many times they do heal.
And in another positive sign, ABC News suggested its team could be headed back to the U.S. as early as tomorrow for further treatment after a brush with death on one of the world's most dangerous stories. Jim Maceda, NBC News, Landstuhl, Germany.
The injuries suffered here by our ABC News colleagues are all too typical for the victims of this kind of roadside bomb. After each attack like this, the medical teams who treat the injured refer to something they call the golden hour, when every moment starts to count. Here is NBC News Chief Science Correspondent Robert Bazell.
Within 40 minutes of the attack,
Bob and Doug could be flown back to the U.S. as soon as tomorrow. Their doctors will meet with the families first thing tomorrow morning and make the determination then. Elizabeth?
All right, Jim Sciutto in Germany, thanks so much. Immediately after the attack, Bob's first words to his producer, Vinny Malhotra, were, "Am I alive?" As Jim Sciutto reported, the U.S. military hospital in Balad played a major role in keeping Bob alive. It is one of the most sophisticated battlefield hospitals ever created. Here's ABC's Dan Harris.
This is how the routine often begins. A chopper bearing the wounded touches down at the military hospital in Balad.
This is a full-service trauma ER, and we're ready to handle anything that they throw at us.
Many of the injuries are caused by IEDs.
It's hard to move.
Sergeant Chris Chillis, a substitute teacher from California, was in a convoy that got hit by one.
These IEDs, improvised explosive devices, are crude but lethal. They are the single greatest cause of death among U.S. soldiers in Iraq. Last year, insurgents set off more than 10,000 of these homemade bombs and 221 just last week alone. And as ABC's Jonathan Krall reports, ending roadside bombings is now a primary mission of the American military.
Today in Lafayette, Indiana, friends and family are remembering 23-year-old specialist Matthew.
Over President Bush's Supreme Court nominee, Judge Samuel Alito, liberal Democrats led by Massachusetts Senators John Kerry and Ted Kennedy today went ahead with a filibuster attempt, trying to block or at least slow down the nomination, but their effort did not even come close. They needed 41 votes. They got 25, with 72 senators voting to cut off debate and go ahead with the confirmation vote. During the debate, Kennedy argued the Senate should take more time to consider the Alito nomination.
What's more important to the United States Senate than a vote for the Supreme Court of the United States? What's more important? What's coming on back? Oh, we're going to deal with the asbestos issue. Oh, well, isn't that important? Sure, it's important to some people, but not in this bill. This is the issue. This is the time. This is the nominee.
Judge Alito's final confirmation vote now set for tomorrow morning, just hours before the president's State of the Union address. That brings us to some brand new NBC News Wall Street Journal poll numbers just out tonight. And joining us now with those, our NBC News Washington Bureau Chief, moderator of Meet the Press, Tim Russert. Tim, good evening. We should start at the very beginning and that all-important approval number.
Brian, the president hoped that he had made some progress, but that's not the case. We only have a 39% job approval rating for George W. Bush. A clear majority, 54%, disapprove.
And Tim, what about the agenda, the issues as the voters see it?
These are the top priorities for the American people. First, Brian, Iraq, not surprising. Bring the hope troops home, 35%. Health care, 20%. Stimulate the economy, 17%. The prescription drug program, 11% say that's their top goal. Fix it. Cut the deficit, 8%. Cut taxes, 7%. And Brian, Iraq, now 2 out of 3 Americans say it is their view that the troops should come home.
And what about setting the agenda, Tim? Who do they say should be doing that?
This is rather striking. Only 1 in 4 Americans, 25%, say the president should set the policy. Congress, 49% of Americans say it should be them. And both equally, 16%.
And Tim, 2 issues have been hot domestically. Domestic eavesdropping of late and the lobbying scandal in Washington. Where are they playing politically?
Here's lobbying, Brian. Which party is more influenced by special interests? 22% of Americans say the Democrats, 36% say no, it's the Republicans, and 33%, a third of Americans say both parties equally. Then we talk about eavesdropping, Brian. It's very important. This is the president's position in effect. Should there be wiretaps without court order? 51% approve, 46% disapprove. That's the president's position in favor. But what about concerns? 56% say they have concerns about wiretaps without warrants. 43% say they're not concerned. Brian, it's quite striking. Both those issues, lobbying and wiretapping, big in Washington debates, but on a list of priorities for America, on the bottom. And when asked whether they think that lobbying reform, if enacted by Congress, would change things, 65% of the American people say wouldn't change things very much.
Tim, thanks as always. The fresh polling numbers out tonight. Tim Russert in our NBC News Washington Bureau. And a program note here tonight. I'll be joining Tim Russert on Capitol Hill tomorrow evening for the President's State of the Union address. Full coverage here on this NBC station beginning at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Turning now to business news, just as many Americans are watching their winter fuel bills, America's largest oil company, ExxonMobil, is reporting some jaw-dropping profits tonight. Record profits, in fact, for any American company ever. $10.7 billion in just the fourth quarter of 2005. That's a jump of 27%. And more than $36 billion total for the year. And tonight, Kraft, America's largest food manufacturer, says it will cut 8,000 more jobs and close up to 20 plants in an expansion of a restructuring plan that is already underway at that company. On Wall Street today, the Dow was down a little over 7 points, NASDAQ up 2.5. When NBC Nightly News continues this Monday evening, NBC News In Depth. Billions of dollars in Katrina charity. But in some places, nothing's yet been done. Tonight, where has all the money gone? And later, as the Enron trial gets underway, has there really been any progress in fighting corporate crime? NBC News In Depth tonight, the money trail after Katrina. Last week in the 9th Ward neighborhood of New Orleans, so many people there told us it was as if it was the day after Katrina because so little has been done. Many of the same Americans who gave so much money to charities after Katrina, a record $3 billion, are right about now wondering where it all went and why more hasn't been done. We asked NBC News Chief Investigative Correspondent Lisa Myers to look for some answers. One more note here on the aftermath of Katrina. NBC's Chip Reed reports from Capitol Hill that at Senate hearings today, there were more examples of the poor planning and communication that resulted in a chaotic response at all levels of government. One example, the Department of Interior had offered FEMA hundreds of boats, trucks, and law enforcement personnel for search and rescue. But today, a key FEMA official told the panel he was unaware of the offer until Senate staffers recently showed him the relevant documents. Up next, as we continue here tonight, they were called the smartest guys in the room. Today, they were in a courtroom.
Bad in a corner of his office. The Louisville slugger was a sign of the career that might have been if the Fed chairman had been able to hit a curveball. Fortunately, he was a legend at handling whatever the economy threw at him.
You can quibble over particular incidents and episodes where the policy was perfect, but it was clearly
a former Fed governor was presiding over one of the greatest economic moderations in history. Core inflation was cut in half from 4.4% when Greenspan took office in 1987 to 2% now. Unemployment dipped from 6% to just under 5%. And through 222 months of the Greenspan era, the economy suffered through recession for just 18 of them. As important as helping the economy, Greenspan did not harm it. He was perhaps the first to recognize that productivity growth was taking off in the mid-90s.
Had he not done so, the Fed...
Every good hitter, Greenspan whiffed a few. The chairman did little to head off the stock market bubble of the late 90s, and now some say the housing bubble. He didn't cause the excess, but critics argue Greenspan injected economic steroids, leaving the impression the Fed was willing to clean up the mess no matter what went wrong.
You know, on the one hand, he's been willing...
And what's not, only on the Today Show on NBC.
There is ominous news on the economy to report tonight. The Commerce Department reports that Americans' personal savings was negative last year, clocking in at minus 0.5%. That means people not only spent all of their income for the year, but dipped into savings or went into debt for it. The last time the national savings rate was this low was 1933, just after the bottom of the Great Depression. Tonight in Houston, Texas, a jury has been seated for the federal trial of Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling, the two men who used to run Enron and whose names may forever be synonymous with massive corporate fraud in which the victims were numerous small investors whose savings got wiped out. We get more now from NBC News Chief Financial Correspondent Ann Thompson on the trial and whether anything has changed since Enron.
Together, Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling led Enron, once the nation's 7th largest company.
I'm fine.
And today, together, they went on trial for fraud and conspiracy in its collapse.
In the same way that I think Watergate was a watershed event for the political arena, Enron was that for the business arena.
But 4 years later, where are we in the fight against corporate crime?
Landmark legislation like
Stephen Cutler led the Security and Exchange Commission's Enforcement Division until last April, winning some $6 billion in penalties and the return of ill-gotten gains, as federal prosecutors racked up a string of high-profile convictions. WorldCom CEO Bernie Ebbers, Adelphia founder John Regas, and Martha Stewart. But Cutler, now in private practice, says the fight isn't over.
The vigilance that's required is akin to the sunscreen that you need to put on when you go to the beach. or the dental floss that you've got to use every day. You can't do it just once.
Who knows what percent?
At the University of Chicago Business School, James Schrager uses Enron to scare his leadership students straight.
I wanted to live with Jeff Skilling's pain that he has right now.
But from some, he gets a surprising reaction.
They will argue back with me. They will say, well, you know, Skilling's got $20 million and he's going to beat the rap and he's going to live happily ever after.
Charles Gasparino wrote about the scandals and thinks most corporations have learned some lessons enforced by new financial reporting laws.
What everybody's doing right now is dotting their I's, crossing their T's, and making sure what they disclose is accurate.
And watching closely what happens here to the two men involved in the scandal that cost shareholders $63 billion. Ann Thompson, NBC News, Houston.
And there is word tonight from NOAA, the folks at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that scientists are launching a new snowstorm rating scale like the one we use to measure hurricanes and tornadoes. Like those scales, this new snow system will have categories 1 through 5, but it won't be used as a warning tool. It will be used after the storm has hit for comparison to other storms. For example, a 4 is crippling, a 5 means extreme. It seems like it was just yesterday when the whole world was seeing the same pictures on television, transfixed by the dramatic images, the rescue of a baby named Jessica who'd been trapped in a well. In fact, that was 18 years ago, and that little girl's name was Jessica McClure. Tonight, Jessica is 19 years old. She is also a newlywed. Over the weekend, just outside her hometown of Midland, Texas, she married 32-year-old Daniel Morales. Also tonight, word that the playwright Wendy Wasserstein died today here in New York. She had been struggling with lymphoma for several months. Many of her works chronicled the women of the baby boom generation trying to succeed in a society dominated by men. One of those plays, The Heidi Chronicles, won the Pulitzer Prize and a Tony Award back in 1989. Broadway theaters will dim their lights tomorrow night at curtain time in her honor. Wendy Wasserstein was just 55 years old. We're back with more right after this.
Finally tonight, a colleague said today that for soldiers and in some cases journalists, you can define courage as fear that has said its prayers. By which he meant knowing that an assignment is dangerous, coming to grips with it, getting on with the job. Many of us here have worked a long time with Bob Woodruff and Doug Vogt. We have gotten an enormous amount of comfort from the extraordinary outpouring of messages from you. Here are some of them.
The outpouring has come from all over the world. What shocking news! I have the greatest respect for Bob and his crew as journalists. A prayer from South Korea. I watch Bob every day and it feels as though a family member has been injured. Being a neurosurgeon reservist, I spent 3 months at Landstuhl treating our war wounded. I can attest that Bob and Doug are receiving the finest care this country has to offer. This woman's husband was part of a military escort for Bob and Doug just yesterday morning. My husband said he was dedicated to his job and was determined to show exactly what life is like there for the soldiers. I pray for him and Doug Vogt and for their families. I know their fear knowing a loved one is in Iraq and the danger that persists in the country. This is my husband's second tour and the fear never goes away. Many people expressed an appreciation of the risks that journalists take in war zones. My little brother is in the Army, currently serving in Iraq. If it were not for the journalists who are brave enough to travel to Iraq, the real stories in that region
ever is headed to Torino, Italy. The Olympic Winter Games start 1 week from Friday on NBC.
Once again here tonight, all of us at NBC Nightly News are in a position to send our very best wishes to the families and co-workers of our colleagues at ABC News. It is a reminder that in our highly competitive business, we are colleagues and we are friends first and foremost. It is also a reminder, and a sobering one at that, of the dangers and pressures faced every day by this nation's all-volunteer military force. While we won't be happy until Bob Woodruff and Doug Vogt are safely home and on U.S. soil, we have the very same wish for all families waiting for a loved one to return. That is NBC Nightly News for this Monday night. Thank you for being with us. I'm Brian Williams in New York. We'll see you tomorrow evening from Capitol Hill in Washington for the President's State of the Union address. Good night.
Cameron Swayze.
Chet Huntley. David Brent. John